The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in a way that seemed designed to torture the nervous system. Emma sat in the oversized witness chair, a booster seat beneath her to elevate her enough to be seen by the jury, but nothing could make her look less fragile, less broken. Her pink dress, the one her grandmother had carefully chosen because Emma used to love pink, hung loosely off her tiny shoulders. She'd lost weight in the 6 months since the incident. The doctors said it was stress-related trauma manifesting physically in a 3-year-old body that didn't yet have the cognitive tools to process what had happened to her. What haunted Detective Marcus Chen the most wasn't Emma's silence. It was her eyes. They were dead, completely, utterly dead. Not the dead of sleep or tiredness, but the dead of something precious being stolen away. Children's eyes were supposed to sparkle with curiosity, with mischief, with the wonder of discovering the world. Emma's eyes looked like she'd already seen the worst the world had to offer and decided it wasn't worth looking anymore. Marcus had been a detective for 17 years. He'd worked homicides, gang violence, drug trafficking, crimes that would make most people's blood run cold. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the systematic, calculated evil inflicted on children. And the worst part, the absolute worst part was that the man responsible was sitting 15 feet away, leaning back in his chair like he was watching a football game instead of a trial that would determine his fate. The defendant's name was Richard Holloway, 43 years old, a contractor who'd done repair work at Emma's apartment building. He had no criminal record, which meant he'd been careful, calculated, and predatory. He'd groomed Emma's mother first, earning her trust, offering to help with repairs, accepting cups of coffee while complimenting her parenting. Then, over the course of 2 months, he'd gradually maneuvered himself into situations alone with Emma. At first, it was innocent seeming, watching her in the living room while her mother ran to the store, offering to help with her bath when her mother was exhausted. But gradually, imperceptibly, the abuse had escalated. Until one day, Emma's mother returned home early and found him. What she discovered in that moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. Now, sitting in this courtroom, Marcus watched Holloway's face. The defendant had the audacity to smirk, an actual, genuine smirk, as he looked at Emma. It was the smirk of someone who believed he'd already won, who believed that a 3-year-old's word meant nothing, who believed that his attorney's expensive suit and legal maneuvering would be enough to walk him out of here a free man. That smirk made Marcus's blood boil. He'd seen it before in other pedophiles, this unshakable confidence that children were unreliable witnesses, that trauma made children's testimony inadmissible, that the legal system was stacked in their favor. And unfortunately, in many cases, that confidence was warranted. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Lopez, was packing outside the courtroom during the break, practically vibrating with frustration. Marcus could see it in every line of her body, the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept clenching and unclenching her fists, the dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept properly since taking this case. Jennifer was one of the best prosecutors in the district, known for her meticulous case preparation and her unwavering commitment to justice. But she was also a realist, and the reality of this situation was devastating. "We have nothing," she told Marcus yesterday in her office. "We have a medical examination showing trauma consistent with abuse. We have a mother's testimony about finding him with Emma. We have circumstantial evidence placing him in the building at the time of incidents. But without Emma's testimony, the defense will argue it could have been anyone. They'll claim the mother misidentified the situation, that she's a vindictive ex-client angry about repair costs. And you know what? A decent defense attorney can create reasonable doubt with just that narrative." 6 months. That's how long Emma had been essentially nonverbal, not completely silent. She would speak to her grandmother, her mother, and her therapist in whispers and fragmented sentences. But when it came to the incident itself, when anyone asked her what happened, she would shut down entirely. Her body would go rigid. Her lips would seal shut. Her eyes would go to that dead, empty place. The child psychologist brought in to evaluate her said Emma had completely dissociated the trauma, that her mind had essentially locked the memories away as a survival mechanism. It's actually quite common in cases of early childhood trauma, the psychologist had explained in a report that made Marcus want to punch a wall. The victim's developing brain protects itself by fragmenting memories and suppressing details. Forcing the child to recall these events can actually cause further psychological damage. So what were they supposed to do? Leave a child rapist on the streets because his victim's mind had protected itself? Let him walk because of the very trauma he'd caused? It seemed like the ultimate betrayal, the final insult added to the violence of the original crime. Emma's grandmother, Margaret, sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table. She was 82 years old, and this case had aged her another decade. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tissue. Margaret had raised Emma from birth. Emma's mother worked nights as a nurse, and Margaret was her primary caregiver, which meant Margaret blamed herself. She'd been the one who'd opened the door to Holloway. She'd been the one who'd trusted him when he seemed so helpful and respectful. She'd been the one in the other room when the abuse happened. Marcus had sat with Margaret for hours, trying to convince her that none of this was her fault, that Holloway was a professional predator who knew exactly how to manipulate trust, that guilt was a natural response but a misplaced one. But nothing could ease the weight she carried. She looked at her great-granddaughter sitting in that oversized chair, dead-eyed and traumatized, and Margaret bore the crushing weight of her own perceived failure to protect her. The judge, Honorable Richard Stratton, had been reviewing case law all morning. Marcus could see the exhaustion and conflict in his face. Stratton was a fair judge, respected on both sides of the courtroom, genuinely committed to justice. But he was also bound by law and procedure. Rules of evidence didn't bend just because the victim was 3 years old and traumatized. Without the child's testimony, we're going to have significant difficulty, Stratton had said in chambers that morning. The defense motion to exclude the mother's second-hand account is likely to succeed. We'd be left with medical evidence and circumstantial evidence, and juries need more than that. Everyone in that courtroom knew the truth. They could see it in Emma's body language, the way she flinched whenever Holloway moved, the way she kept her eyes fixed on her grandmother rather than on her abuser, the way her small body held itself as if bracing for another blow. They could see the truth in the mother's raw grief, in the grandmother's guilt, in the prosecutor's desperation. But knowing and proving were two different things. The legal system demanded evidence, testimony, corroboration. And the star witness, the only person who could provide the most crucial testimony, was so traumatized that she couldn't speak. The clock was ticking. The trial was halfway through. In a few days, the judge would instruct the jury and they would deliberate. And unless something miraculous happened, unless Emma somehow found her voice and overcame her trauma to testify, Richard Holloway would walk out of this courtroom a free man. He would return to his life, perhaps more careful next time, but ultimately unchanged. Emma would grow up knowing that her abuser had faced no consequences, that the system had failed her. Justice was slipping away, moment by moment, breath by breath, and nobody in that courtroom had any idea how to stop it. Detective Marcus Chen hadn't slept in 36 hours. His third cup of coffee sat cold and abandoned on the desk beside him, a thin film of congealed cream floating on top like a metaphor for his dying hope. The precinct was quiet at 3 a.m., just the occasional sound of the building's ancient HVAC system groaning, the distant hum of the evidence room's climate control, and the soft clicking of Marcus's keyboard as he desperately searched for anything that might save this case. His captain had basically told him to accept defeat 4 hours ago. Captain Rodriguez had called him into her office and said the words Marcus had been dreading. "Let it go, Chen. Sometimes cases don't work out. We do our best, we build the strongest case we can, and we accept when the law doesn't bend the way we want it to. This one's over. The kid won't testify. Without the kid, we don't have enough. Holloway walks. That's the reality." Marcus had wanted to argue, to fight, to rage against the injustice of it all. But Rodriguez was right, and he knew it. The law was the law. Procedure was procedure. And a 3-year-old girl couldn't testify herself out of trauma just because a detective willed it hard enough. He'd gone home, but sleep wouldn't come. He'd lain in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Emma's dead eyes, thinking about Richard Holloway's smirk, thinking about the message that would be sent if Holloway walked free, that if you preyed on children, if you chose victims who couldn't speak, you could escape justice. The thought made Marcus feel physically ill. By 11 p.m., he'd given up on sleep entirely and returned to the precinct. He sat in an all-night diner across the street, nursing increasingly terrible cups of coffee, scrolling through his laptop. He'd read every psychological study on childhood trauma he could find. He'd watched hours of interviews with therapists who specialized in child abuse. He'd looked at past trial transcripts where child witnesses had somehow overcome their trauma to testify. And he'd come up empty every single time. That was when the documentary came on the television, mounted in the corner of the diner. It was a small thing, really. The kind of program that airs at 3 a.m. when the diner's clientele consists of insomniacs, shift workers, and desperate detectives. But Marcus's eyes caught the title, Heroes with 4 Paws, K9 Units Changing Lives. He'd started to ignore it. He was looking for information about child psychology, not cute dog stories. But something made him pause, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. The documentary featured several police dogs and their handlers. It showed German shepherds tracking missing persons, detecting explosives, apprehending suspects. Standard K9 content that Marcus had seen dozens of times before. But then the segment changed, and a woman's face appeared on the screen. K9 Officer Sarah Mitchell. Blonde hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, intelligent eyes, the bearing of someone who'd spent years in law enforcement. And beside her, the most magnificent German shepherd Marcus had ever seen. The dog was introduced as Duke, a specially trained victim support animal. Duke isn't trained to apprehend criminals, Officer Mitchell explained to the camera. He's trained to provide comfort and emotional support to trauma victims, particularly in high-stress situations like courtroom testimony. The documentary then showed footage of Duke with a young woman, couldn't have been more than 18, who was testifying in a sexual assault case. The girl was visibly terrified, shaking on the verge of a breakdown. Then Duke was brought into the courtroom and something almost miraculous happened. As the dog sat beside her, the girl's breathing began to stabilize. Her trembling lessened. Her voice, when she spoke, was steadier, more confident. The girl testified completely, her trauma still evident but her courage undeniable. The science is fascinating, a neurologist interviewed for the documentary explained. When a traumatized person is in the presence of a calm, non-threatening animal, their amygdala, the fear center of the brain, actually begins to normalize its activity. The animal essentially provides a neurological anchor that allows the victim to feel safe enough to access their memories and speak about their trauma. Marcus had watched the entire segment twice, his coffee forgotten, his exhaustion temporarily forgotten. By the time it ended, he was checking his phone for Officer Sarah Mitchell's precinct information. It was 3:47 a.m. He didn't care. He called the non-emergency number and asked to be connected to Officer Sarah Mitchell's voicemail. He left a message so urgent, so desperate, that the voicemail system asked if this was an emergency. He'd hung up and sat in the diner for another hour, barely daring to hope. What were the chances that Officer Mitchell would even call him back? What were the chances that she could get Duke into a courtroom? What were the chances that it would work for Emma the way it had worked for that girl in the documentary? But hope, Marcus was discovering, was a dangerous thing. Hope was something you grabbed onto when everything else was slipping away. The phone rang at 6:07 a.m. Sarah Mitchell had an unusually calm voice for someone being called by a desperate stranger at 6 in the morning. Marcus explained the case, quickly, efficiently, leaving nothing out. He talked about Emma's trauma, her dissociation, her inability to testify. He talked about the monster sitting in a courtroom waiting to walk free. He talked about the profound injustice of a legal system that protected criminals by default but left victims defenseless. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Marcus's heart sank. She was going to say no. She was going to explain why it wasn't possible, why Duke had never been in a courtroom setting, why it would be too risky to try something so unconventional. Then Sarah Mitchell said 5 words that would change the course of the case. "We'll make it work." Marcus had to ask her to repeat it. When she did, he actually felt tears prick his eyes. For the first time in 36 hours, hope felt like something real, something tangible. "Duke has been trained for victim support, but we've never attempted formal courtroom testimony," Sarah explained. "However, his training is comprehensive. He's certified, he's proven, and I've seen what he can do firsthand. If there's a judge willing to take the risk, I'm willing to try." "The judge is going to fight this," Marcus warned. "The defense will claim it's prejudicial, that it's coaching the witness, that it's unconstitutional." "Let me worry about that," Sarah said. "You worry about getting the judge to agree to a hearing. I'll present Duke's credentials and training. And Marcus, I've seen a lot of dogs do a lot of amazing things, but I've never seen anything quite like what Duke does to traumatized victims. He doesn't just comfort them, he seems to unlock something in them, something brave, something honest, something true." After he hung up, Marcus sat in the diner for another hour, processing what had just happened. He'd gone from complete despair to cautious optimism in the span of a documentary and one phone call. It was insane. It was unconventional. It probably wouldn't work. But it was their only chance. He called Ada Jennifer Lopez at 8 a.m., before her office even officially opened. He told her about Duke, about Officer Mitchell, about the documentary and the research. He could hear the skepticism in her voice. This was her case, and she'd already accepted defeat. Taking an unconventional route meant risking the judge's displeasure, meant giving the defense ammunition for appeal. "It's crazy," Jennifer said flatly. "Completely crazy," Marcus agreed. "It'll never work." "Probably not," Marcus conceded. "But we're out of other options." "We are," Marcus confirmed. There was a long pause. Then Jennifer said, "Send me everything you have on this dog and this officer. Everything. I want to know every study, every certification, every case where this has been attempted. Because if we're going to walk into that courtroom with this gamble, we need to be absolutely prepared." Marcus spent the next 48 hours preparing the most meticulous presentation of his career. He gathered every research paper on animal-assisted therapy, every court case where animals had been allowed as support animals, every certification Duke possessed. He interviewed Sarah Mitchell extensively about Duke's training, his success rate, his specific capabilities. He documented the neurological science behind why animals help traumatized brains. When he finally presented it all to Judge Stratton in chambers, with Jennifer beside him and Sarah Mitchell standing to present Duke's qualifications, Marcus could see the skepticism on the judge's face. This was unconventional. This was risky. This was the kind of thing that could be appealed, overturned, used against them. But the judge was also looking at Marcus with understanding, because Stratton was a judge, and he dealt in evidence and procedure and law. But he was also a human being, and he could see a child who needed help. "If Officer Mitchell can certify that this dog won't interfere with the proceedings," Stratton said slowly, "and if the defense doesn't object too strenuously, I'm willing to allow it. One time, one chance. If it doesn't work, we proceed without it." The defense attorney objected, vehemently. He filed motions, argued precedent, claimed emotional manipulation. But in the end, even he couldn't quite find legal grounds to prevent a certified support animal from comforting a child witness. The gamble was going to happen. Duke would come to court, and Emma would have her one chance at being brave enough to speak. The morning of Emma's testimony, the entire courthouse seemed to hold its breath. Word had spread through the building about the unconventional approach, a police dog in the courtroom during a child's testimony. It was the kind of thing that would be discussed in legal circles for years, either as a brilliant innovation or a cautionary tale of desperation overriding procedure. The hallways buzzed with whispered conversations. Lawyers paused mid-conversation. Court clerks exchanged knowing glances. Officer Sarah Mitchell arrived at 7:30 a.m., 2 hours before the testimony was scheduled to begin. Duke walked beside her on a perfectly fitted vest that identified him as a certified victim support animal. The vest was deep blue with official insignia, designed to signal to everyone in the courthouse that this was not a pet, not a mascot, but a professional working animal with a specific, crucial job to perform. Sarah took Duke to a quiet corner of the courthouse, a small conference room that had been set aside for them. She needed him calm, centered, ready for the most important work of his life. This wasn't a training exercise. This was real, and the stakes couldn't be higher. "You ready, boy?" she whispered, running her hand over his muscular shoulder. Duke leaned into her touch, his brown eyes steady and intelligent. She'd had him for 5 years, had trained him herself, had worked with him in dozens of cases. But this felt different. This felt monumental. In another part of the courthouse, Emma was having a very different kind of morning. Her grandmother had dressed her in the same pink dress from before, the one Emma used to love before her world shattered. Margaret's hands shook as she buttoned each small button. Emma was silent, as she'd been silent for 6 months. But today, there was something different in her expression. A kind of resigned acceptance, perhaps, or maybe just the weight of knowing that something important was about to happen. Emma's mother, Claire, stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. She'd been in this state since discovering Holloway with Emma, not quite present, not quite absent, moving through the world like a ghost haunted by her own failure to protect her daughter. The guilt was consuming her, even though everyone, Marcus, Jennifer, the therapist, everyone, insisted it wasn't her fault. She couldn't make herself believe it. "Emma, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, kneeling down to Emma's level. "Today is a very important day. There's going to be a special dog in the courtroom, a very nice dog. His name is Duke. Would you like to meet him?" Emma's eyes, those dead, empty eyes that broke Marcus's heart every single time he saw them, flickered slightly. A spark of something. Curiosity, maybe. Or just the automatic response of a 3-year-old to the mention of a dog. "He's a police dog," Margaret continued, trying to inject enthusiasm into her voice even though her heart was breaking. "A very special police dog. He's going to be right there with you while you're in the courtroom. He's going to sit right next to you." Emma didn't respond, but Margaret thought she detected the tiniest nod. It was something. In the context of Emma's silence, it was everything. At 9:15 a.m., Detective Marcus Chen stood outside the courtroom, his stomach churning with anxiety. Jennifer Lopez was beside him, her jaw clenched, her eyes fixed on the courtroom doors. They'd done everything they could. The rest was up to Emma and Duke. "Whatever happens," Jennifer said quietly, "we gave it our best shot. That counts for something." Marcus nodded, but it didn't help the dread sitting heavy in his chest. Success meant a traumatized child would have to relive her worst moments. Failure meant a predator would walk free. There was no good outcome here, only degrees of bad. At 9:28 a.m., Officer Sarah Mitchell stood in the hallway outside the courtroom with Duke. They'd spent the last 30 minutes in a quiet space, but now it was time. She adjusted his vest one final time, checked his collar, made sure everything was perfect. The door to the courtroom was closed, but she could hear the judge's voice from inside, making preliminary remarks to the jury. "Let's go, Duke," she said softly. "Time to do what you do best." The courtroom doors opened at 9:32 a.m. Officer Sarah Mitchell walked through first, her uniform pristine, her bearing professional. The courtroom didn't react much to her entrance, just another law enforcement officer in a courthouse. But then came Duke. The German Shepherd moved through the doorway with the kind of grace that only came from extensive training. His ears were up, his posture alert but not aggressive. He wasn't a dog there to intimidate, he was a dog there to heal. But his presence was impossible to ignore. His sheer size, his obvious intelligence, the way he moved with purpose, it commanded attention. The gallery gasped. Several people sat up straighter in their seats. One observer actually whispered, "Holy shit," under his breath before catching himself. The bailiff, who'd been told to expect this but hadn't quite believed it, blinked several times as if the dog might disappear if he looked away. Judge Stratton looked up from his notes, his expression unreadable. The jury members craned their necks, trying to get a better look. The court reporter's fingers paused above her keyboard. Even the court stenographer, who'd seen everything in 20 years of courtroom work, looked genuinely surprised. And then there was Richard Holloway's reaction. The defendant's smirk, that infuriating, confident smirk that had been present throughout the entire trial, faltered. For just a moment, Marcus saw something flicker across the predator's face. Uncertainty, maybe even fear, because Holloway knew what was happening. He knew that his comfortable narrative of a 3-year-old being too unreliable to testify was about to be challenged. But the most important reaction was Emma's. Emma's head snapped up so fast her entire body shifted in the oversized chair. Her dead eyes suddenly focused, suddenly sharpened. For the first time in 6 months, something lit up inside them. Recognition, maybe, or hope, or the primal understanding that a protector had just entered the room. Duke approached slowly, deliberately, with the kind of measured calm that only came from hundreds of hours of training. He didn't make eye contact with anyone except Emma. His entire being seemed focused on her, as if she was the only thing in the courtroom that mattered. Emma started to hyperventilate. Her small chest began heaving rapidly. Her hands, which had been lying in her lap, suddenly gripped the edges of the chair. Several people in the gallery tensed, clearly thinking this was going to fail, that the dog's presence would traumatize Emma further rather than help her. But Sarah Mitchell didn't rush. She'd been through this before, not with a 3-year-old but with other trauma victims. She knew that the initial panic was often followed by something profound. She simply let Duke approach at his own pace, no commands, no forcing it. The dog was doing what he was trained to do, reading Emma's emotional state and responding with exactly what she needed. Duke stopped about 3 feet from Emma's chair. He tilted his head as if asking permission, as if asking, "May I come closer? Are you ready? Can I help you?" Emma's hyperventilation didn't stop, but it began to shift. Her breathing, while still rapid, started to synchronize with the dog's steady, calm respiration. In, out, in, out. The ancient, primal rhythm of a being choosing to calm itself by mirroring another being's calmness. Very, very slowly, Emma extended one trembling finger. It stretched out across the space between them, shaking with the effort, reaching for the impossible, reaching for safety, for comfort, for the promise that she wasn't alone in this nightmare. Duke's nose met her fingertip. The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. It was a moment so small it could be measured in fractions of a second. One tiny finger touching one dog's nose. But it was also a moment of such profound significance that everyone present would remember exactly where they were standing, exactly what the light looked like, exactly how the air felt in that instant. Emma's trembling didn't stop, but it changed in character. It became less panic and more the trembling of a child processing overwhelming emotion, not just fear, but something else, something like relief, something like the first glimmer of belief that help might actually be possible. Sarah Mitchell gave a single, almost imperceptible hand signal. Duke moved closer and sat down beside Emma's chair with the kind of grace that seemed impossible for a dog of his size. He was 90 pounds of muscle and bone, but he settled beside Emma like he weighed nothing at all, like his entire purpose was simply to exist beside this broken child and let her know she wasn't alone. Emma's free hand, the one not touching Duke's nose, slowly, hesitantly, reached out and buried itself in the dog's fur. Her grip was tight, desperate, as if she was afraid he might disappear if she didn't hold on hard enough. And Duke didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He simply sat there, a living, breathing, solid presence. His calm became hers. His steadiness became hers. His unshakable presence became the anchor that allowed Emma to do something she hadn't been able to do in 6 months. The prosecutor felt tears forming in her eyes. The judge leaned forward. The jury members exchanged glances of understanding. And for the first time since the trial began, Marcus Chen allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Emma might actually be able to speak. The courtroom had transformed into something sacred. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer somehow, or maybe everyone's attention had narrowed so completely that nothing else mattered. Emma sat in that oversized chair, Duke beside her, her small hand buried in his fur. Minutes passed, long, profound minutes that felt like hours and seconds simultaneously. The courtroom existed in a state of suspended animation, everyone afraid to breathe, everyone afraid to move, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Emma's breathing synchronized with Duke's, in and out, in and out. The dog's chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, and Emma's breathing gradually matched that rhythm. The hyperventilation that had threatened to spiral into panic slowly, incrementally, transformed into something manageable. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up near her ears, gradually lowered. The white-knuckle grip she'd had on the chair edges loosened, her fingers uncurling. Judge Stratton watched this process unfold with an expression of wonder and deep understanding. He'd been on the bench for 23 years. He'd seen countless witnesses, adults with decades of life experience and education, struggle to testify about trauma. He'd seen grown men break down, experienced lawyers lose their composure, professional witnesses crumble under pressure. But he'd never seen anything quite like what was happening now. A 3-year-old girl, systematically broken by violence and abuse, was being methodically reassembled by the presence of a dog. The prosecutor, Jennifer Lopez, had her eyes closed. She wasn't praying exactly. She wasn't religious in any formal sense, but something close to prayer was happening in her mind. She'd worked victim advocacy for 14 years before becoming a prosecutor. She'd seen the system fail victims in countless ways. She'd learned to live with the compromise and the injustice and the heartbreak that came with trying to fight monsters within a system that wasn't designed to protect the most vulnerable. But this, whatever was happening between Emma and Duke, this felt like the system working the way it was supposed to work. Like justice wasn't just about punishment, but about healing. Detective Marcus Chen found his own hands clenched so tightly his fingernails were drawing blood from his palms. He released them deliberately, forcing himself to breathe, forcing himself to stay present. He'd been awake for 53 hours now. The exhaustion was a physical thing, sitting on his chest like a stone. But none of that mattered. Nothing mattered except what was happening in front of him. Officer Sarah Mitchell stood motionless about 10 feet from Duke and Emma. She'd removed her hand from Duke's collar, letting the dog work without any external control. This was Duke's expertise, Duke's moment. Her job was simply to be present, to ensure nothing interrupted the connection forming between the dog and the traumatized child. Holloway sat at the defense table, his smirk completely gone now. His attorney had leaned over and was whispering something urgently, but Holloway wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Emma, and for the first time, his expression showed something other than confidence. It showed fear. He understood on some instinctive level that his plan was unraveling. Another 5 minutes passed. The bailiff glanced at Judge Stratton, uncertain whether protocol should interrupt this moment. The judge gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Let it continue. Whatever was happening, it was too important to interrupt. Finally, Emma opened her eyes fully. The deadness that had characterized her gaze for 6 months was still there, but it was now accompanied by something else, something brave, something that looked a lot like determination. Very slowly, Emma turned her head to look at the prosecutor. It took almost a full minute for Emma to move her head those few degrees. Every muscle seemed to resist the movement, as if her trauma-fractured brain was still trying to protect her by keeping her frozen. But she did it. She looked at Jennifer Lopez, and in that look was a question. Are you ready? Can we do this? Jennifer stood slowly, deliberately, moving with the careful grace of someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. She didn't approach Emma directly. Instead, she positioned herself at an angle, non-threatening, her voice when she spoke pitched low and soft, almost at a whisper. "Emma, sweetie," Jennifer said, "I know you're scared. I know you don't want to talk about what happened, and that's okay. Nobody's going to make you do anything you don't want to do, but I want to ask you a question and you can answer it however you want. You can nod, you can shake your head, you can whisper, you can use as many or as few words as you want. Okay?" Emma didn't respond, but she also didn't look away. Duke, with the kind of perception that bordered on the miraculous, shifted slightly, not moving away, but adjusting his position to offer even more support. His entire body angled toward Emma now, creating a physical barrier between her and the rest of the courtroom. "Emma," Jennifer continued, her voice steady and calm, "do you feel safe right now, with Duke here?" Emma's head moved, just barely, just a fraction of an inch, but it was unmistakably a nod. The entire courtroom seemed to exhale simultaneously. "Thank you for being so brave," Jennifer said, and she meant every word. "Now I want to ask you something else, okay? And I want you to know that whatever you say is okay, even if it's hard, even if it's scary, okay?" Another nod, slightly more confident this time. "Emma," Jennifer said, and now her voice was even quieter, almost just above a whisper, "can you tell me what happened? Can you tell me who hurt you?" The courtroom went absolutely silent. Every single person present was holding their breath. This was the moment. This was everything. Emma's entire body trembled. Her grip on Duke's fur tightened. The dog responded by pressing slightly closer, offering more weight, more solidity, more presence. For a long moment, a moment that stretched out like taffy, elastic and seemingly endless, nothing happened. And then Emma opened her mouth. The voice that came out was barely audible. It sounded like wind through a broken window, like the rustling of dead leaves, like the smallest whisper from the deepest trauma. It sounded like a 3-year-old girl who hadn't spoken about her pain in 6 months, finally releasing it into the world. "He hurt me." The words landed in the courtroom like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that would extend far beyond this room, this trial, this single moment in time. Those 4 words, simple, declarative, devastating, contained within them the weight of everything Emma had endured. The silence, the pain, the terror, the betrayal. For a moment, Jennifer didn't push further. She simply let those words sit in the courtroom, let the jury absorb them, let the testimony breathe and exist. But then Emma did something even more extraordinary. While keeping her grip on Duke's fur, while maintaining her physical connection to her emotional anchor, Emma raised her other hand and pointed. She pointed directly at Richard Holloway. The defendant went absolutely white. His attorney grabbed his arm, but Holloway barely seemed to notice. His entire body had gone rigid. And then Emma spoke again. More words this time, still whispered, still barely audible but unmistakable in their clarity. "He put his hands on me." The courtroom erupted, not in noise but in a collective gasp, a recognition of the enormity of what had just happened. A 3-year-old girl had just testified to her abuse. She had identified her abuser. She had described, in however limited terms, what had been done to her. Jennifer wanted to push further to get more details, more corroboration. But she was a professional, and she recognized the limit of what Emma could handle. She nodded respectfully to the child. "Thank you, Emma," Jennifer said. "You were very brave. You can rest now." Emma immediately turned back to Duke, burying her face in his neck. The dog shifted to accommodate her, creating a protective cocoon around her small body. The judge looked at the defense attorney expectantly. "Any questions, counselor?" The defense attorney stood, but he was shaking. He looked at the jury, at Emma, at Duke, and then back at his client. Holloway was mouthing something, gestures becoming more frantic, but his attorney simply shook his head and sat back down. "No questions, Your Honor," he said quietly. There was nothing to ask. There was nothing to defend. The girl had spoken. The monster had been identified. The moment had crystallized into certainty. Judge Stratton looked at Duke, then at Officer Sarah Mitchell, then at Emma. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture of profound emotion from a man trained to remain impartial. "The witness may step down," he said quietly. "This court will take a 30-minute recess." As Officer Sarah Mitchell gently guided Duke away from Emma, a process that took several minutes because Emma refused to release her grip on his fur. The implications of what had just happened began to settle over everyone present. A 3-year-old girl had found her voice, and everything had changed. The 30-minute recess extended to 45 minutes. No one was paying attention to the clock. The courtroom had become a space where normal time seemed to have no meaning, where the usual procedural flow had been disrupted by something extraordinary. In the hallway outside the courtroom, people stood in small clusters, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Word had spread through the courthouse like electricity through a circuit. The child had testified. The child had spoken. The impossible had happened. In a small conference room, Emma sat on her grandmother's lap, Duke's head resting against her leg. Officer Sarah Mitchell stood nearby, giving them space but remaining available. Emma wasn't talking. She'd retreated back into silence now, her energy spent, her emotional reserves completely depleted. But her body was different. The rigid tension that had characterized her for 6 months had softened slightly. She was still traumatized, still broken, but no longer quite so shut down. Margaret stroked her granddaughter's hair, tears streaming down her weathered face. She couldn't speak without her voice breaking. Sarah Mitchell brought her a cup of water, which Margaret accepted with a grateful nod. Duke remained perfectly still, as if understanding that his job now was simply to exist beside Emma, to provide the quiet reassurance that he was here, that she was safe, that she had been brave. "Thank you," Margaret whispered to Officer Mitchell, the words inadequate for the magnitude of gratitude she felt. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Sarah replied gently. "Duke did this. Emma did this. All I did was bring them together." But that wasn't quite true, and Sarah knew it. What she'd done was far more significant than that. She'd risked her career on an unconventional approach. She'd believed in something that couldn't be guaranteed. She'd trusted that a dog and a traumatized child could create something powerful enough to overcome months of silence. In the prosecutor's office, Jennifer Lopez stood at the window looking out over the city. Her paralegal was attempting to brief her on the next steps, witness scheduling, evidence presentation, jury instructions, but Jennifer wasn't fully present. She was thinking about what had just occurred in that courtroom. She was thinking about the implications. "We need to document everything that just happened," she said, cutting off her paralegal mid-sentence. "Every detail, every moment, because this is going to matter beyond this trial. This is going to matter for every other child who's been too traumatized to testify." Her paralegal looked confused. "We won the testimony, didn't we? We have what we need for the conviction." "We have more than that," Jennifer said, turning away from the window. "We have proof that there's a better way. We have evidence that a trauma-informed approach works. We have documentation that a specially trained dog can unlock a child's voice when nothing else can. This goes beyond Richard Holloway. This is bigger." In the defense attorney's office, a smaller, less prestigious space than the prosecution's, Richard Holloway sat with his lawyer, his face a mask of fury and panic. His attorney, Marcus Weinstein, was trying to manage expectations. "The testimony is damaging," Weinstein said carefully, But we still have options. We can argue that a 3-year-old's testimony is inherently unreliable. We can suggest that the dog's presence was coaching or leading her. We can file motions for mistrial based on the unconventional procedure. We're not done yet. But even as he said it, Weinstein knew it was largely theater. He'd been practicing criminal defense for 20 years. He knew when a case was lost. He'd seen it in the jury members' faces when that little girl pointed at his client. He'd heard the finality in those words. "He hurt me." Holloway's hands were clenched into fists. "That little bitch was supposed to stay silent," he said viciously. "That was the whole plan. Children don't testify. Children don't remember. Children are unreliable." "Your plan didn't account for the dog," Weinstein said flatly. "And neither did I, neither did anyone." In the courthouse hallway, Detective Marcus Chen was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Raw, genuine, transformative hope. He'd gotten coffee from the vending machine, which tasted like liquid tar, and he was drinking it anyway because it was something to do, something to keep himself grounded in reality. Because reality felt surreal. A judge he knew slightly, Judge Patricia Hernandez from the Family Court Division, approached him. She'd been in the courtroom observing the testimony, and her expression was intense. "That was extraordinary," she said without preamble. "What you did today, that approach. I've got a case, a 7-year-old who's been through similar trauma, nonverbal, completely shut down. Would Officer Mitchell be willing to consult on that case?" Marcus felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about Richard Holloway anymore. This was about establishing a new precedent, opening new possibilities for countless other children. "I'll give you her contact information," Marcus said. "But more than that, I think we need to document this. I think we need to create a protocol, a training program, something that can be replicated in other jurisdictions." Judge Hernandez nodded vigorously. "I'm already thinking about that. This needs to be formalized, standardized. What happened in that courtroom today, it shouldn't be dependent on one detective's desperation and one officer's willingness to take risks. It should be something every jurisdiction can access." By the time court reconvened, the news had spread through the entire courthouse. Court reporters were discussing it in the break room. Bailiffs were talking about it in the hallways. Other judges, other prosecutors, other defense attorneys, everyone had heard about the dog and the child who finally spoke. The afternoon session was shorter than expected. The prosecution presented its remaining evidence, the medical examination showing trauma, the photographs of Emma's apartment building establishing Holloway's presence, the timeline of events. But everyone in the courtroom knew it was almost ceremonial now. The real verdict had been delivered when a 3-year-old girl pointed at her abuser and said, "He hurt me." The defense called no witnesses. Holloway's attorney made a brief closing argument attempting to create reasonable doubt, but his heart wasn't in it. He was going through the motions, fulfilling his obligation to his client while knowing that the case was lost. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict in a clear, unwavering voice. Guilty on all counts. Sexual abuse of a minor, aggravated assault, everything. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. No celebration, no outbursts of joy, just a profound sense of rightness, of justice delivered, of a system that had nearly failed actually coming through when it mattered most. Holloway's face went absolutely white. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Holloway seemed to be in shock. He'd been so confident, so certain that a child's silence would protect him. The child's words had destroyed him instead. In the gallery, Margaret pulled Emma close, and for the first time in 6 months, she allowed herself to truly cry, not tears of grief or guilt or despair, but tears of relief. Emma, not fully understanding what had happened but sensing the shift in emotional energy, reached out toward where Duke and Officer Mitchell stood at the back of the courtroom. Sarah Mitchell caught Emma's eye and gave her a small, proud nod. Duke tilted his head, as if acknowledging the girl who'd taught him something new about courage. That evening, as news of the trial spread, something remarkable began happening. Law enforcement agencies across the country started reaching out to Officer Sarah Mitchell. Victim advocates began requesting information about victim support dogs. Judges started considering policy changes. And most importantly, other children who'd been silent, children who'd been broken, started seeing a possibility they hadn't seen before. If a 3-year-old could find her voice with a dog beside her, maybe they could too. The story of Emma and Duke began spreading through news networks, not as a feel-good animal story, but as a serious examination of trauma-informed justice. National publications ran features on specialized victim support animals. Academic journals published research on the neurological basis for why animals help traumatized witnesses testify. Legislation was proposed in multiple states to formally allow certified victim support dogs in courtrooms. What had started as one detective's desperate gamble was becoming a movement. And at the center of it all was a 3-year-old girl and a German shepherd who'd shown the world that healing and justice didn't have to be mutually exclusive, that sometimes compassion and accountability could exist together, and that sometimes the most powerful tool in the courtroom wasn't evidence or argument, but simply the presence of something kind enough to make a traumatized child believe she could be brave. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks after the guilty verdict. The courtroom was packed differently this time, not with curiosity seekers and legal observers, but with people who understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Emma didn't attend the sentencing. Her therapist had advised against it, and everyone agreed. She'd done her part. She'd been brave enough. Now it was time for the system to do its job. Judge Stratton sat elevated on his bench, looking down at Richard Holloway, who stood before him in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles shackled. The transformation from smug predator to caged criminal was complete. Holloway's attorney had prepared a mitigation statement, arguments about Holloway's difficult childhood, his lack of prior criminal history, his potential for rehabilitation. It was a standard defense motion, delivered by rote, without any real conviction that it would change anything. The prosecution's victim impact statement was more powerful. While Emma couldn't testify about the sentencing, her mother, Claire, stood before the judge and spoke about the devastation the abuse had caused. Her words were halting, broken by sobs, but absolutely devastating in their honesty. "My daughter is 3 years old," Claire said, her voice trembling. "She should be learning to read, learning to count, learning to trust the world. Instead, she's learning that the world isn't safe, that people hurt you, that speaking up might be the only way to survive. No child should have to learn those lessons, and no child should have to learn them at 3 years old." She described the nightmares, the behavioral regression, the way Emma flinched at unexpected touches. She described her own guilt, her sense of failure as a mother. She described the months of therapy, the slow, incremental progress, the way Emma was gradually beginning to trust again, all because of a dog and a system that finally believed her. "Richard Holloway didn't just steal my daughter's innocence," Claire said, her voice hardening. "He stole 6 months of her childhood. He stole her ability to trust. He stole her voice. And while no sentence can give those things back to her, I'm asking this court to ensure that he never does this to another child. I'm asking for the maximum sentence, not for revenge, but for protection. Because the only way to keep children safe from this man is to remove him from society." Judge Stratton listened carefully, taking notes, his expression grave. He'd been on the bench for 23 years and he'd heard countless victim impact statements. But this one landed differently. Maybe because it involved a child. Maybe because he'd witnessed Emma's testimony. Maybe because he understood viscerally and completely what was at stake. Holloway was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing. He stood, his shackles rattling as he moved, and looked directly at the judge. His attorney had advised him to apologize, to show remorse, to demonstrate that he understood the severity of his actions. Instead, Holloway did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom. He smiled. It was brief, quickly suppressed, but unmistakable. A smile that suggested he found something amusing about the proceedings. A smile that suggested he still, even now, didn't fully comprehend that his predatory calculations had failed. Judge Stratton's expression hardened. He'd seen that smile, and it had crystallized something in his mind, absolute certainty about what needed to happen next. "Mr. Holloway," Judge Stratton began, his voice cold and controlled, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of heinous crimes against a child. Crimes that cause severe, lasting trauma to an innocent victim. In my 23 years on this bench, I have presided over many serious cases, but I have rarely encountered someone as lacking in remorse, as fundamentally predatory, as completely devoid of human compassion as you have demonstrated yourself to be." He paused, letting his words settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. "You believe that a 3-year-old child would be incapable of testifying against you," Judge Stratton continued. "You believe that trauma would silence her forever. You were wrong, not because the child suddenly became verbal or magically overcame her psychological injuries, but because we finally, as a society, decided to listen to her. We provided her with the support she needed to speak her truth. And in doing so, we proved that your predatory calculations don't work when we value our children enough to protect them properly." The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture of profound emotion from a man trained to maintain judicial composure. "The maximum sentence available to this court is 30 years, Judge Stratton said. "I am imposing that sentence, to be served without possibility of parole for a minimum of 25 years. You will spend the best years of your remaining life incarcerated, and perhaps, in your cell, you will finally understand the magnitude of the harm you caused." He banged his gavel with a finality that echoed through the courtroom. "This court is adjourned." The sound of that gavel seemed to reverberate through more than just the courtroom. It echoed through the courthouse, through the legal community, through victim advocacy organizations across the country. 30 years, the maximum possible sentence. A message sent loud and clear. Predators of children would face the full weight of the law. As Holloway was led away in handcuffs, he made eye contact with Detective Marcus Chen. For just a moment their eyes met, and Marcus saw something shift in Holloway's expression. A recognition, perhaps, that his victim had defeated him, that a 3-year-old girl had been more powerful than all his calculations, all his confidence, all his predatory expertise. Outside the courtroom, as people filed into the hallway, there was a palpable sense of closure mixed with something larger, a sense that something had shifted in how justice could be served. Prosecutors who'd been struggling with similar cases approached Marcus and Jennifer with urgency in their voices. "Can we contact Officer Mitchell?" asked Ada David Torres, who was prosecuting a case involving an 8-year-old who'd been nonverbal since her abuse. "We need to know if she can help us." "How do we get certified victim support dogs in our jurisdiction?" asked Judge Patricia Hernandez. "I have at least 3 pending cases that could benefit from this approach." The calls kept coming. Over the next week, Officer Sarah Mitchell received inquiries from law enforcement agencies in 14 different states. Universities wanted to conduct research on the Duke Protocol, as it was being called. Victim advocacy organizations wanted to develop training programs. One prominent legal scholar published an opinion piece in a major newspaper titled "The Future of Victim-Centered Justice: Lessons from a German Shepherd Named Duke." But perhaps the most significant development came from Emma's own case. Her therapist, Dr. Rachel Kim, approached Jennifer Lopez with a proposal. "We need to document what happened here," Dr. Kim said. "Not just for Emma's personal healing, but for the field of trauma psychology. What Duke provided was essentially a neurological bridge, a way for Emma's brain to access her memories safely because she felt protected. We should research this, formalize it, make it available to other trauma victims. Jennifer immediately connected Dr. Kim with Officer Sarah Mitchell, and together they began laying the groundwork for what would become the National Victim Support Animal Initiative. Their proposal outlined training protocols, certification standards, courtroom procedures, and psychological research supporting the use of victim support animals in testimony situations. The proposal was revolutionary. It suggested that with proper training and oversight, specially selected and trained dogs could become an official part of the criminal justice system, not as gimmicks or emotional comfort objects, but as therapeutic tools with documented neurological benefits. Judge Stratton received a copy of the proposal and read it carefully. He then wrote a formal recommendation to the state's judicial conference, detailing his observations from Emma's case and endorsing the expansion of victim support animal programs. His recommendation carried significant weight. Stratton was respected across the judiciary, known for his conservative approach to procedure and his commitment to law rather than innovation. "What I witnessed in my courtroom," Stratton wrote, "was not an aberration or an exception. It was a glimpse of what justice could be when we prioritize the needs of vulnerable witnesses. The presence of a trained support animal didn't compromise the integrity of the trial or the reliability of testimony. It enhanced both by creating an environment where a traumatized child could safely access her own truth. I believe this approach should be systematized, standardized, and made available across the jurisdiction." In the weeks following sentencing, the media coverage intensified. News outlets that had initially covered the trial as a curiosity, "Dog helps child testify," began examining the larger implications. Major newspapers published investigative pieces on how many child abuse cases went unprosecuted because victims couldn't testify. They highlighted the systemic failures that had nearly allowed Holloway to escape justice. But they also highlighted the solution, and that solution was named Duke. Officer Sarah Mitchell became an unexpected advocate for victim-centered justice. She gave interviews, wrote op-eds, and spoke at conferences about the intersection of animal-assisted therapy and criminal prosecution. She was careful to emphasize that Duke wasn't unique in his ability to help traumatized victims. There were other dogs with similar training, but that the approach itself was revolutionary. "Every trauma victim deserves this option," Sarah said in one interview. "Not because dogs are magic, but because they provide something our legal system has historically failed to provide: unconditional support for the person whose voice matters most." Duke didn't make Emma testify. Emma made the decision to be brave. Duke just gave her permission to do it safely. The ripple effects extended far beyond the courtroom. Universities began offering courses on trauma-informed justice. Law schools incorporated victim support protocols into their curricula. Police academies added victim support dog training as an option for officers interested in specializing in victim services. And most importantly, other traumatized children began finding their voices. Within 6 months of Emma's trial, 17 additional cases in the state had utilized victim support animals in testimony. 14 of those cases resulted in convictions. The conviction rate for child abuse cases involving victim support animals jumped from 42% to 78% in just 1 year. The numbers told a story of systemic change. But the real story, the human story, was about a 3-year-old girl who'd been silenced by trauma and a dog who'd given her permission to speak. That story had sparked something larger than anyone had anticipated, a fundamental reimagining of how the justice system could serve its most vulnerable witnesses. Richard Holloway sat in his cell in the state penitentiary, serving his 30-year sentence, and understood too late that his miscalculation had cost him everything. He'd believed that silence would protect him. Instead, a child's courage, enabled by a dog's compassion, had destroyed him utterly. And somewhere outside the prison walls, life continued. Emma continued to heal. Duke continued to work. And the transformation of the American justice system, one child's voice at a time, continued forward. The invitation arrived on official letterhead from the National Association of Prosecutors. Officer Sarah Mitchell read it 3 times to make sure she was understanding correctly. They wanted Duke to be the featured speaker, well, the featured dog, at their annual conference. The largest gathering of prosecutors in the country, attended by thousands of legal professionals from every state. Sarah laughed when she read it, a genuine belly laugh that made Duke tilt his head in confusion. "You're going to be a conference speaker, boy," she said, scratching behind his ears. "That's a new one." But as the conference date approached, Sarah realized this wasn't actually funny. It was profound. An organization that had existed for over a century, that had historically focused on evidence, procedure, and legal strategy, was now formally recognizing that a dog, a living, breathing animal, had something valuable to teach about justice. The conference was held in Denver and the turnout was staggering. The main ballroom was packed with over 3,000 prosecutors, judges, victim advocates, and legal scholars. When Sarah walked onto the stage with Duke, the standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. People were on their feet, applauding not just Duke but what he represented, a new way of thinking about justice, a fundamental shift in how the system could serve victims. Sarah didn't give a traditional speech. Instead, she told Duke's story, not the sanitized version that had been in news reports, but the real story. The years of training, the failures along the way, the cases where Duke's presence hadn't immediately solved the problem. She talked about the science behind trauma and how animals helped rewire traumatized brains. She discussed certification standards, liability concerns, and the specific training protocols that made victim support dogs different from emotional support animals or therapy dogs. But most importantly, she showed footage from Emma's courtroom testimony. Not the dramatic moment when Emma pointed at Holloway. That remained confidential, protected by victim privacy laws. But the moment just before, when Duke approached and Emma reached out to touch his nose. The courtroom gasped at the footage, understanding viscerally what it meant to witness a child reconnecting with safety. "Duke didn't testify for Emma," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "Duke didn't make Emma speak. Emma made that decision herself. What Duke did was provide the neurological and emotional foundation that made it possible for her to access her own courage. And that's what victim support animals do. They don't substitute for justice. They enable justice." Response was overwhelming. By the end of the conference, Sarah had received inquiries from 47 law enforcement agencies interested in establishing victim support animal programs. Universities wanted to partner on research. Publishers wanted to commission books about the protocol. And most significantly, the National Association of Prosecutors passed a formal resolution endorsing the use of certified victim support animals in courtroom testimony for vulnerable witnesses. Back home, Duke became something of a local celebrity. News vans parked outside the police department. School groups requested to visit and see the dog who changed justice. Local businesses donated dog treats and toys. One pet food company approached Officer Mitchell about a sponsorship deal, an offer she politely declined, wanting to keep Duke's work focused on helping victims rather than commercial interests. But the recognition extended far beyond Duke himself. The case sparked a national conversation about how the legal system had historically failed children. Major publications ran long-form investigative pieces examining child abuse prosecutions across the country. They found staggering numbers. Approximately 60% of child sexual abuse cases went unprosecuted because victims were deemed unreliable witnesses or were too traumatized to testify. They highlighted the trauma-centered legal system had created, one that demanded victims relive their worst moments in sterile courtrooms surrounded by strangers, without any support beyond the procedural. Emma's case became the catalyst for systemic change. Within a year of the sentencing, 7 states had passed legislation specifically authorizing certified victim support animals in courtrooms. 3 universities had launched research programs studying trauma-informed justice, and dozens of law enforcement agencies across the country had begun training their own victim support dogs. The Emma Protocol, as it became formally known, established strict standards for victim support animals. They had to be professionally trained, certified, and supervised. Their handlers had to complete specialized training in trauma psychology and courtroom procedure. The animals had to be evaluated for temperament, behavior stability, and their ability to remain calm under stress. It wasn't about bringing any friendly dog into court. It was about creating a standardized, professional approach that could be replicated and verified across jurisdictions. Judge Stratton, who had made the initial decision to allow Duke into his courtroom, became an unexpected champion of the protocol's expansion. He published several articles in legal journals detailing his observations from Emma's case and the theoretical and practical benefits of victim support animals. His credibility as a conservative jurist lent significant weight to the arguments. When Judge Stratton, who had spent his career emphasizing procedure and protocol, publicly endorsed a revolutionary new approach, it gave other judges permission to do the same. The American Bar Association formed a task force on victim-centered justice that prominently featured the Emma Protocol as a model. Law schools began teaching trauma-informed approaches in their criminal procedure courses. The National Judicial College incorporated victim support animal training into their educational programs. But perhaps the most significant cultural shift was in how society began thinking about children's testimony. For centuries, the legal system had treated children's words with skepticism. They were seen as unreliable, easily influenced, prone to fantasy and imagination. Emma's case had fundamentally challenged that assumption. Here was a 3-year-old girl whose testimony was absolutely clear, unambiguous, and ultimately irrefutable. She hadn't been confused or influenced. She'd been traumatized and silent until provided with the support she needed to speak. That reframing changed everything. If a 3-year-old could testify reliably with proper support, then the issue wasn't the reliability of children's testimony. It was the reliability of a system that forced traumatized children to testify without support. Detective Marcus Chen was recruited to help develop training programs for victim support dogs in other departments. He traveled across the country, speaking at police academies and prosecutor conferences, explaining how Duke had changed his approach to victim support. He was invited to speak at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit about the neurological foundations for why animals help traumatized witnesses. What we discovered through Duke, Marcus said in one presentation, is that justice isn't served by forcing victims to be brave. Justice is served by creating conditions where victims can safely access their own courage. And sometimes, that means a dog sitting beside them in court. Officer Sarah Mitchell was offered numerous promotions and transferred opportunities, each one offering more prestige and higher pay. She turned them all down. She wanted to stay in the field, working with trauma victims, training the next generation of victim support dogs. She'd found her calling, and it had nothing to do with climbing professional ladders. Instead, she established the Duke Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to training and certifying victim support animals, providing them to law enforcement agencies regardless of ability to pay, and conducting ongoing research on trauma-informed justice. The Foundation's mission statement was simple: every victim deserves support. Every dog deserves purpose. The Foundation became remarkably successful. Within 3 years, it had trained and certified over 200 victim support dogs working in 43 states. Each dog had a story similar to Duke's, a specially selected animal that had undergone hundreds of hours of training to provide precisely the kind of support that traumatized victims needed. Media coverage evolved from the sensational "dog saves child's court case" to the substantive. Major news organizations published deep-dive investigations into how victim support animals were changing case outcomes, how they were improving the psychological recovery of trauma victims, how they were creating a more humane approach to justice. One documentary filmmaker spent 18 months following Officer Mitchell and 3 victim support dogs through multiple cases. The resulting film, Voices of Courage, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was later shown on multiple streaming platforms. It told the stories of several trauma victims and the dogs who'd helped them testify, stories that were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. The film's impact was significant. It reached audiences who would never attend a legal conference or read a judicial review. It made the abstract concept of victim support animals concrete and emotionally resonant. It showed real children, real dogs, real moments of courage that had been enabled by simple compassion and professional expertise. Universities began offering specialized degrees in victim support animal training and trauma-informed justice. The field that essentially didn't exist 3 years earlier was becoming professionalized, systematized, and integrated into mainstream criminal justice practice. But perhaps the most telling indicator of Duke's legacy was the change in conviction rates for child abuse cases. In the 5 states that had fully implemented the Emma Protocol, conviction rates for child sexual abuse cases increased from 42% to 78%. More than just statistics, these numbers represented hundreds of children whose abusers had been held accountable, children who would grow up knowing they'd been believed, protected, and vindicated by a system that had finally learned to value their voices. Duke himself became something of a historical figure. Legal scholars referenced him in academic papers. Law schools showed courtroom footage in their classes. Psychology textbooks discussed his case as a turning point in understanding trauma and testimony. Children's books were written about the dog who helped children speak. Duke had become more than a working dog. He'd become a symbol of systemic transformation. National television shows wanted to feature him. Toy companies proposed Duke action figures and plushies. One major film studio approached Officer Mitchell about making a dramatic feature film based on Emma's case. Through it all, Sarah Mitchell remained focused on the work itself. Duke was a dog, she reminded everyone, not a celebrity. He had a job to do, and his job was to help traumatized victims find their voices. Everything else, the fame, the recognition, the cultural impact, was secondary to that mission. And Duke, for his part, seemed to understand his purpose completely. Whether sitting beside a terrified 5-year-old in a courtroom, visiting a therapy session with a recovering survivor, or training the next generation of victim support dogs, Duke brought the same calm presence, the same unconditional support, the same quiet understanding that safety was the foundation for courage. The legal system that had nearly failed Emma had been fundamentally transformed by her case. And at the center of that transformation was a German shepherd who'd done nothing more extraordinary than sit beside a broken child and offer her the safety she needed to heal. That, it turned out, was revolutionary. 2 years after the trial, Emma stood in her bedroom looking at 2 photographs on her nightstand. The first was from the day after the sentencing, Emma and her grandmother at the park, both of them smiling genuine smiles for the first time in what felt like forever. The second was from Duke's retirement ceremony 6 months ago, Emma with her small hand resting on the dog's head, both of them looking directly at the camera with a connection that transcended words. Emma was 5 years old now. Kindergarten had started 3 weeks ago, and for the first time in her young life, she was approaching school without fear. Her therapist, Dr. Rachel Kim, said it was remarkable progress for a child who'd experienced such severe trauma. But Emma didn't think about progress or trauma or any of the clinical language that the adults in her life used. She just knew that the nightmares came less frequently now. She knew that she could be touched without flinching. She knew that the world, while still sometimes frightening, was also full of kindness and safety, and people who believed her. Her grandmother, Margaret, stood in the doorway watching Emma get ready for school. At 84 years old, Margaret had been given a second chance at joy, the chance to watch her great-granddaughter heal, to see the light return to Emma's eyes, to witness a child learning to trust the world again. "You excited about school today, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, her voice soft and warm. Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Miss Chen is teaching us about animals today. I want to tell her about Duke." Margaret smiled, tears pricking at her eyes as they often did these days, not tears of grief or guilt, but tears of gratitude and wonder at how far Emma had come. The guilt that had consumed Margaret for so long had gradually been replaced by something else: pride in her great-granddaughter's courage, and gratitude for a system that had finally protected her. The courtroom had been cruel, harsh, and terrifying, but the dog had transformed it into something else. The dog had made it a place where a 3-year-old girl could be brave. Emma's mother, Claire, was doing better too. The depression and guilt that had shadowed her for 2 years had lifted gradually as Emma healed. Seeing her daughter smile, hearing her laugh, watching her learn to trust again, it had been Claire's own path to healing. She'd started working with a therapist specializing in parental trauma, and she discovered that she could forgive herself for not seeing the signs sooner, for not protecting Emma from Holloway's predatory manipulation. One evening, Claire had sat down with Emma and explained in age-appropriate terms what had happened. Emma had listened with the seriousness of a 5-year-old processing important information, and then asked the most profound question: "Is the bad man going to get out?" "No, sweetheart," Claire had said gently. "The bad man is going to stay in prison for a very long time, because you were brave and told the truth about what he did. You helped keep yourself and other children safe." Emma had nodded, seeming to understand at some deep level that her voice had power, that her truth mattered, that she had helped shape justice itself. The trial had fundamentally changed how Emma understood her own agency. In the aftermath of the abuse, she'd believed herself to be powerless, a victim upon whom violence was inflicted, with no control over her own body or circumstances. But testifying, speaking her truth, pointing at her abuser, these acts had returned some sense of agency to her. She had done something. She had been heard. Her words had consequences. That understanding, her therapist explained, was crucial for trauma recovery. Victims often emerged from trauma feeling permanently powerless, but Emma had been given the opportunity to act, to be heard, to matter in the outcome of her own case. And that had transformed not just the legal proceedings, but her entire relationship with her own life. At school, Emma was thriving. She'd made friends, 3 of them, which seemed like an impossibly large number to her grandmother, who remembered how withdrawn Emma had been just months earlier. She was learning to read, learning to write her name, learning the social skills that other kindergartners took for granted. The trauma was still there, still part of her neurology, still something she'd carry with her throughout her life. But it was no longer the defining characteristic of her existence. Dr. Rachel Kim, Emma's therapist, had become something of a national figure in her own right. She'd published several papers on trauma-informed approaches to child therapy, with Emma's case as a central example. She'd been invited to speak at conferences about the intersection of animal-assisted therapy and psychological recovery. And she'd started a new research initiative examining how victim support animals could be integrated into therapeutic settings, not just courtrooms. "Emma's case taught us something crucial," Dr. Kim said in one presentation. "That healing isn't just about processing trauma in a therapist's office. Healing is about restoration of agency, about being believed, about having your voice matter in the world. Duke facilitated all of that. And we need to think about how we can replicate those conditions across multiple settings, in therapy, in schools, in the community." Officer Sarah Mitchell visited Emma and her family regularly. These weren't official visits. They were personal, genuine connections between people bound by a shared experience of witnessing something transformative. Duke, now retired from active duty, came along on these visits. The dog was older now, his muzzle graying, his movements slightly slower. But his eyes still held that same gentle intelligence, that same capacity for understanding and providing comfort. Emma and Duke had a ritual. The moment Sarah and Duke arrived, Emma would run to the dog and bury her face in his neck, not in fear or distress, but in joy and affection. Duke would respond by pressing closer, his tail wagging slowly. It was a connection that needed no words, no explanation. Emma and Duke had shared something profound. They had been present for each other at a moment when it mattered most. On one visit, Emma asked Sarah a question that caught the officer slightly off guard. "Will Duke ever get sick?" Sarah knew what Emma was really asking. "Will the dog who saved me eventually leave me?" "Duke is 9 years old now," Sarah said gently, sitting down on the floor beside Emma and Duke. "That's pretty old for a dog. He has maybe a few more years if we're lucky. But right now, Duke is healthy and happy. And even when Duke gets older, the love he gave you won't go away. It stays inside you. It helped make you brave." Emma seemed to understand this on some level. She lay her head on Duke's side, and the dog adjusted to accommodate her, creating a warm cocoon of safety and connection. The impact of Emma's case had extended far beyond her own healing. In the 2 years since the trial, victim support animals had been introduced in 17 states. Hundreds of trauma victims had testified with the help of trained dogs. Conviction rates had increased across the board. And most importantly, children who'd been silenced by trauma had found their voices. But Emma's personal impact was perhaps most significant for the people closest to her. Her grandmother had written a book, a memoir about guilt and redemption, and the courage of a 3-year-old girl who'd been braver than any adult. The book had been published by a major publisher and had become a bestseller in the grief and recovery category. In writing it, Margaret had processed her own trauma and guilt and emerged with a clearer understanding of what responsibility actually meant. Not the crushing guilt of an imperfect protector, but the mature understanding that she'd done the best she could with the knowledge she had, and she'd supported Emma fully once the truth emerged. Emma's mother had become involved in victim advocacy, volunteering with an organization that helped families of abuse survivors navigate the legal system and the long path to healing. She used her own experience to help other parents who were drowning in guilt and rage and helplessness. By helping others, she was helping herself heal. And Emma herself, the child at the center of everything, was learning to live a normal childhood. She still had trauma responses. Certain sounds would cause her to freeze. Certain types of touch required patience and trust building. She still had nightmares occasionally, dreams where bad things were happening but she couldn't speak or run or fight back. Her therapist said these were normal, expected responses to what she'd experienced. They would likely never fully disappear, but they would become manageable enough that they wouldn't define her life. In her kindergarten class, Emma was known as the quiet girl with the good imagination and the gentle way with other children. None of her classmates knew her story. None of them knew about the trial, the courtroom, the dog who changed everything. To them, Emma was just Emma, a kind girl who included everyone in games, who shared her crayons, who seemed to understand instinctively when someone else was scared or sad. That intuitive empathy, that capacity to recognize pain in others, was perhaps the most unexpected gift that had come from Emma's trauma. She'd learned suffering young, and that learning had given her a kind of wisdom about human vulnerability that other children her age didn't possess. It wasn't a gift she'd chosen. It wasn't a trade she would have accepted. But it was there, woven into who she was becoming. On warm afternoons, Emma and her grandmother would walk to the park near their home. They'd sit on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, and Emma would talk about her day, about the things she'd learned, the friends she'd made, the games she'd played. Margaret would listen, treasuring every word, every laugh. every moment of normalcy that indicated her great-granddaughter was truly healing. Sometimes, during these moments, Margaret would think about Richard Holloway, now serving his 30th year in prison. She'd heard through legal channels that he'd become a model prisoner, not because of rehabilitation or genuine remorse, but because he was afraid. Prison had revealed to him what he'd never understood in the outside world, that his victims had power, that his crimes had consequences, that the legal system, when properly supported and properly informed, would protect children and hold abusers accountable. It was a small comfort, perhaps, but a comfort nonetheless. Holloway would spend the rest of his life in prison, unable to harm other children, unable to prey on society. Justice, delayed by trauma but ultimately delivered by a 3-year-old girl and a German shepherd, had been served. 5 years after the trial, Emma would start first grade. 7 years after the trial, she would be a normal child navigating normal childhood challenges. She would have good days and bad days, like all children. She would learn and grow and develop into her own unique person. The trauma would always be part of her story, but it would become less and less the whole of her story. And somewhere, in the hearts and minds of countless other children who found their voices through victim support animals, Emma's courage would continue to echo. Not because she'd done anything exceptional. She'd just been brave enough to speak truth while a dog sat beside her. But that simplicity, that essential humanity, was exactly what made it revolutionary. The legal system hadn't been fixed by Emma's case. Justice remained imperfect, flawed, sometimes cruel, but it had been transformed. It had been made more humane. It had learned to listen to the smallest voices, to protect the most vulnerable, to honor the courage of children who spoke their truth. And it had all started with a detective's desperate gamble, a prosecutor's willingness to try something unconventional, a judge's openness to possibility, and a dog named Duke who understood, without needing to be told, exactly what a traumatized child needed to heal. Emma sat at her desk in her kindergarten classroom, crayons spread before her, drawing a picture of a dog and a girl holding hands, or paws and hands, technically. Her teacher, Miss Chen, looked over her shoulder and smiled at the simple beauty of the image. "That's a beautiful picture, Emma," Miss Chen said. "Who are they?" Emma looked up with absolute certainty in her eyes, eyes that had once been dead, but were now alive with possibility and hope. "That's me and my friend Duke," Emma said simply. "He helped me be brave." And in that simple statement, in that child's understanding of what had happened and what it meant, the entire transformation was encapsulated. Not as a legal precedent or a policy change or a statistical increase in conviction rates, but as the lived experience of a child who had been broken and had been given the tools to heal. That was Emma's second chance. And that was Duke's legacy, that sometimes the most powerful force in the pursuit of justice isn't evidence or argument or legal procedure, but the simple, profound act of standing beside someone who is afraid and saying, through presence alone, "You are not alone. You are safe. You can be brave." The end.